All right, now that we've started thinking about some of the different obstacles to good thinking, good critical thinking, let's begin looking at some of the specific ways that Vaughn outlines how this can occur. Right, so let's begin with self-centered thinking. There's different ways that this happens, but the basic idea here is that it's a psychological obstacle, which means it's a problem with how we think, not with what we think. And this psychological obstacle to, good critical thinking and critical reasoning, it generally takes two different forms. On the one hand, somebody might accept some proposition or some claim or statement about the world solely on grounds that it actually, in some sense, advances or coincides with what they already believe, with their own interests, something that is going to boost their ego, if you will. Right. So if somebody comes up to me and they give me some information about how well Patrick Mahomes is performing in the offseason, I'm likely to believe it because I am a Chiefs fan, a Kansas City Chiefs fan, independent on whatever the evidence is. I might just simply believe it because it's something that makes me happy. It coincides with what I already believe and what I hope does happen in the future. That the Kansas City Chiefs are going to have a successful season and so forth. Right. Again, that's just a very simple kind of toy example. Later on, we're going to look more specifically at cases where we actually seek out evidence that confirms what we believe and we deny or we avoid evidence contrary to our beliefs. This type of obstacle to good thinking is oftentimes called confirmation bias, and it comes in a lot of different forms. So we'll look at that here in a little bit. But the basic idea is that, people might just simply accept some claim about the world because it makes them happy, because it advances what they already like, what they already enjoy. It coincides with what they already believe in their own self-interests. Now, a different form of the same sort of obstacle to good thinking is when we accept something simply because it helps us save face. Now, this is a phrase that you may have heard before, but I'm not sure that everybody really quite understands what saving face actually means. And this is something that will come up on your quiz for this module. So I want to spend some time talking about what exactly does it mean to save face. All right. So when we say that somebody's saving face, what that actually means is that they are, in some sense, trying to avoid humiliation, or they're trying to avoid being exposed to air or to some other kind of problem. It's a way in which they're trying to maintain their status, maintain their maybe the professional respect or their general respect in the community, right? So they're avoiding some sort of something that would make them look bad. Oftentimes, this is described as a situation where you, or maybe someone that you know, either explicitly or implicitly might be guilty of a kind of self-centered thinking, right? Where they're trying to make sense of what they've done in a way that's going to make themselves look better. So we can think of different guidelines to avoid this kind of self-centered thinking, or whatever the particular issue might be is very personal. If it's something that matters quite a bit to you, if it involves some sort of cognitive risk or maybe humiliation, then you should pay particular attention to that. And it might affect you in some specific or significant way. It's also important to be aware of different situations where thinking critically can be easily undermined. In those sorts of situations, we should ask ourselves, have I left something out? Am I forgetting about something? Am I ignoring something? Have I really looked through the details? Have I paid attention to the nuances? Or am I just simply rushing through things? Or maybe I'm specifically avoiding something because it arises some sort of emotion in me. Or maybe I'm ignoring something or leaving something out in order to avoid being humiliated or being exposed to air or some other kind of disrespect. And so I think this point about saving face, which is essentially tied to some sort of a personal feeling that we have. We want to look good. We want to look respected. We want to be praised, right? We don't want to feel humiliated or exposed to any kind of air. And that really connects to this point about the different ways in which emotions or passions can be problematic when we're trying to do good critical thinking. right? Arguably, these sorts of emotions or passions tend to be a red flag, right? They help us to know when we might be, of course, not always, but when we are oftentimes thinking in a kind of a self-centered way, thinking in a way where our passions are running really high. When the topic or the issue makes us feel particularly emotional, right? We might think of examples like abortion, right? It might be very difficult to think about different arguments in the abortion debate because this arises a lot of emotions and passions in us. So we need to be able to see that as a red flag. Not that we should stop thinking or that we should ignore these issues, but that we should just be aware of them and how they might be influencing the way that we think. Can you think of other sorts of examples where, one might give a very emotional response to something that's highly personal or maybe some sort of a controversial topic? You might wonder, does the mere fact that you might have these emotional responses mean that you're not thinking critically? But of course, that's not always the case. The mere fact that you have an emotional response doesn't mean that you're not thinking critically. You can do both at the same time. You can both feel passionately about something and be genuinely upset or outraged or happy or excited, right? You can do all that while still trying to pay attention to the details, while seeking out contravening evidence. The point is to be aware of these red flags so that way we can make sure that they're not influencing the way we think. And especially if all we're doing is relying upon our emotions, if we're making judgments or forming beliefs simply because of the emotional responses that arise in us, then that is itself a problem. All right, so now that I've made that point, I've got this question for you. True or false? If your response to some proposition P is combined with both an emotional response and an attempt to think about why you're having that response, then you're not thinking critically. In that particular case, that would be false. You can still be thinking critically, even though you've got these emotional responses. In fact, it's basically impossible sometimes to eliminate these emotional responses. That's why we call them an emotional response in the first place. There's something physiological happening to us. There's something happening in our bodies that we're not in control of. We're sort of like passive agents. We're not choosing to have this response. It's just happening to us. But we can choose proactively or with some sort of intention to make choices or form beliefs in response to the evidence rather than to our emotions, right? We can respond in various ways in spite of these emotional responses that we might be having. And so then that raises another true or false question. If your response to some proposition P is the only justification that you provide for why you believe whatever that happens to be, or it's your only support for the premise in an argument, let's say, then you are, in fact, thinking critically. Well, that's false, right? If you are using your emotional responses as justification for why you believe something, or if you're using your emotions as support for some premise, then these things are not truth apt, right? Only statements or claims or propositions that are truth apt, they can be either true or false. Those are the sorts of things that we can use in support of why we believe something, or in support of why we take some premise in an argument to be true, right? Emotions don't have a truth value. They're just some physiological thing that's actually happening to us. They're not either true or false. Now, in the next video, I want to spend some more time thinking about this idea of group-centered thinking and how group-centered thinking actually influences what we believe in all sorts of different ways, ways that we're typically not aware of. But before we move on to the next video, let me just say at the outset that humans are by nature social animals, right? We're of course not the only social animals. There's many non-human animals that are very, very social. This is something that helps us evolutionarily speaking, right? This fact can be actually a very, very good thing in all sorts of ways. Presumably, we can think of all sorts of different examples that demonstrate this this aspect, this fact about us as being social animals, and how we can, see this being a benefit. The fact that we are able to work in communities and to build cities and roads and bridges and being able to communicate and go through culture and trade and barter and develop the sorts of societies we have and the governments that we have, all of these aspects are social aspects of us, and they help us live. They help us be successful and flourishing. Without these social aspects, we would not really be able to do much in this world. But there's also very important examples where this actually demonstrates how it can be harmful, how these social aspects can cause a lot of pain and suffering, and certainly can be harmful for the way in which we're thinking, the sort of psychological obstacles that we're considering. So we'll look at some of those in the next video, but I just wanted to bring this point to the fore here at the end of this video before we move on.